We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 5b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought Reish Lakish, who says that the Minchas Omer, if the Kamitza is taken Shalol Lishma, if the fistful is taken not for its sake, so it is kosher to burn on the Mizbeach, but the Shireha, the remainder of that Minchas Omer, it can only be eaten when another Omer is brought, because that's going to be the matir, that's going to be what permits the new grain. And the question of the Gemara on the previous summit was that according to Reish Lakish, why should one be able to burn the Kometz on the Mizbeach if again Chodosh, new grain, is prohibited? There's a halacha that it has to be mimashke Yisrael. We learned that from a pasuk, min hamutter li Yisrael. It has to be something mutter, the new grain. It's still osher, so how can you burn it on the Mizbeach? And on the previous summit, Rav Papa offered an approach to Reish Lakish and said that Reish Lakish holds that Heyer Mizrach, just the sun rising on the 16th of Nisan, even when no Omer is brought, that is enough to permit the grain, and that's true even when there was a Beis HaMikdash, just the Heyer Mizrach is enough. And the Gemara in the previous summit quoted Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan again, that Heyer Mizrach is matir, that when the sun rises in the east on the 16th of Nisan, that is the matir. And the Gemara continues and says, V'had Reish Lakish, and this statement of Reish Lakish, La befeirish itmar, it wasn't stated explicitly, Ela michlala itmar, rather, it is inferred. And the Gemara says, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Ein mevian minchas bikurim u minchas behema, kodem laomer, the halach is one cannot bring the minchas bikurim and minchas behema before the omer, vim hevi pasel, and if one brings it before the omer, then it is pasel, it's disqualified. Kodem l'shtei halechem lo yavi, and even before the shtei halechem, which is brought on Shavuos, one shouldn't bring. Vim hevi, but if he does bring then kosher, then already it is kosher. In other words, with regards to the omer, if he brings these before the omer, then they are pasel, they're completely disqualified by the shtei halechem. So l'chatchila, one shouldn't bring it at that time before the shtei halechem. But if one does bring it before, so it is still kosher. V'yamar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak says, Amar Reish Lakish, the Reish Lakish says, Lo shanu ela barba aser uvechamisha aser. When we're talking about bringing it before the omer, that it's problematic. That's if, for example, it was brought on the 14th of Nisan or the 15th of Nisan, that would be too early. Aval b'shisha aser, but on the 16th of Nisan, im hevi kosher. If it's brought, then it is kosher. And so it sounds like Reish Lakish is simply saying the 16th, it doesn't go by the bringing of the omer. The matir, the permitter, is the rising of the sun on the 16th. Alma, we see Kosavar that he holds Heyer HaMizrach matir, that again, the rising of the sun in the east, again, the rising of the sun on the 16th is what is the matir. And Rashi explains, Heyer Mizrach, the Yudvav b'Nisan matir hachodesh, again, the sun rising in the east on the 16th of Nisan, that is what is matir, the chodesh, the new grain. D'chsiv is, it's written at etzem, u'mitargaminon ad b'chranu v'chranu hainu maris hayom. The meaning of the pasuk is, again, maris hayom, when the day is light. D'chsiv tarshish shoam yoshri mitargaminon krum yama shemariso domeliyam. V'haidein shiren nachol. Now Rashi notes, the reason why the remainder is not eaten, again, if we're going to say that the sunrise is matir, why can't the remainder of this omer be eaten? The mitzvah lahamtanat havas omer. It is a mitzvah to wait until the omer is brought. Like we asked, according to Reish Lakish in Perek Rabbi Yishmael later on, the Gemara says again, it is a mitzvah lechatchila to wait until the havas omer. And then the Gemara said, Ein mevian minchas bikurim u minchas behema. It used the language of minchas bikurim and minchas behema. We should note the Mesoras Hashas has tzarach lomar Menachos u bikurim. It's talking about Menachos, carbon mincha, and bikurim, two separate things. And then minchas behema is hainu minchas nesachim. Minchas behema refers to minchas nesachim. That's the mincha that comes along with an animal offering that also has libations. And again, kodem l'shtei halechem lo yavi. These should not be brought before the shtei halechem. Da'aminon b'toras kohanim korban reishas she'e reishas l'chal menachos. That really the shtei halechem should be the first of all menachos of the new grain. Uminayin afla bikurim. How do we know that's true even for bikurim, which are the first fruits? Talmud lomar bikurei ketzir chitim, that we learn from the pasuk. Vim hevi kosher. Now b'di'evid, again, if it's brought before the shtei halechem, it's still kosher. Time mefarish b'perek Yishmael, and that is the reason for that is explained in Perek Rabbi Yishmael. And the Gemara continues with a third opinion regarding Minchas HaOmer Shekamsa Shelo Lishma. Rava Amar, and Rava says, Minchas HaOmer Shekamsa Shelo Lishma. By Minchas HaOmer, if the Kmitza, the fistful, is taken Shelo Lishma, not for its sake, Keshera, it is kosher. Vishiren Necholin, and the remainder can be eaten. Ve'enot Tzricha Minchas HaOmer Acheres Latir, and there's no need for another Minchas HaOmer in order to permit it. She'ein Machshava Moelis, because Machshava is only effective Ela B'misha Roy Lavoda, only by one who is fit to do the Avoda. uvedover haroy le'avoda, and by something which the avoda is fit for it, uvemokam haroy le'avoda, and in a location which is fit for the avoda. And the Gemara explains, b'misha roy le'avoda, when we're talking about someone who is fit for the avoda, la'afuke kohen balmum, that comes to exclude a kohen who has a blemish, uvedover haroy le'avoda, for something that is fit for the avoda, le'afuke minchas ha'omer, delo chazia de chideshu, that comes to exclude the minchas ha'omer. That's our case, again, because that is a chidesh, uvemokam haroy le'avoda, and a place that is fit for the avoda, la'afuke nifkam ha'mizbeach, that comes to exclude if the mizbeach is damaged. And Rashi explains, b'misha roy la'avoda, by one who is fit to do the avoda, l'mu'ute echad min hapsulam, that comes to exclude somebody who is disqualified. The idea is, as we'll see in Rashi, that someone who's disqualified from doing the avoda, if he has a bad machshava, a bad intent, let's say an intent of pigul, when bringing a carbon, so it's not going to be effective to disqualify. Uvidover haroy la'avoda, it's only by something which is fit for the avoda. Again, that's specifically to exclude minchas ha'omer, which is lo chazia, as Rashi will explain in a moment. It's considered not fit because it's a chiddush. Rashi explains, kagon minchas chitin. The point over here is a mincha made of wheat. That's considered something which is royally avoda. Aval minchas ha'omer shel sa'orim, but minchas ha'omer is made of barley, and therefore eina ru'uya ela la'avoda zu bilvad. It really is only fit for this particular avoda lahatir in order to permit, meaning to permit the new grain. Velo mishum karban, and it's not considered to be being brought as a carbon, and so therefore again machshava is not going to be moelis. Machshava is not going to be effective in this case. Again, if it was kamsa shalo lishma, if the intention was not for its sake, so that kind of machshava will not be effective in order to disqualify. That's what Rav is saying. Rashi notes, v'imisham minchasota. Now, if you're going to ask that minchas ha'omer is not the only carbon mincha that's made of barley, what about the minchasota, the mincha brought by the sota? Lav ru'uyahi, the minchasota kemach v'shal omer garish. It's different over there. The minchasota is flour. V'yoda lav avoda hi delavar avon kaasya. Also, that's not an avoda. That's really to clarify the sin. And the reason why machshava does disqualify by minchas kenos, which again is the mincha of the sota, mishum derachmana kirya chatas. That's just because the Torah calls it a chatas. And then finally, mokom haroy la'avoda was to exclude nifkam hamizbeach, pegimas hamizbeach meikra nafka v'zavachta olav esolosecha. We learn out pegimas hamizbeach from the pasuk v'zavachta olav esolosecha, which means bisman shu shalim, the mizbeach has to be whole. Ksiv olav kulo b'mashma, that's what it means. It implies it has to be in its entirety. B'Meseches v'achim b'perakot sheikotchim v'mpigel b'kometz, and if he has an intention of pigel with the kometz, b'shas pegimas hamizbeach, when the mizbeach is damaged, when it's not whole, lav pigel, who the point is it will not be considered pigel. V'myisaken hamizbeach b'os v'ayom yakti renu, and if the mizbeach were to be fixed that day, he would be able to burn it on the mizbeach because it would not be disqualified through that machshava. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabban, and the sages taught in the Brisa, Kishu Omer, when it says in the pasuk min habokar lamata, when it says min habokar below, she'ein tamid lomer, the pasuk doesn't need to say that. Ela lahotzi es hatreifa. The reason why the pasuk says that is that it is an exclusion of the treifa. We'll take a look at the full pasuk. The full pasuk is Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yamarta aleim adam ki yakrav mikem karban la'Hashem. It's talking about bringing a carbon min habehema, min habokar, min hatzon takrivu es karbanchem. The pasuk says you bring a carbon from behema, from bakar, from tzon. And Rashi explains, min habakar lamata dim ola karbono min habakar. It says, im ola karbono min habakar. Bekrad le'el darshinan min habehema lahotzi haroveya v'hanirba. Min habehema, and the pasuk is to exclude roveya and nirba. That's animals involved in bestiality. Min habakar lahotzi hanevad. Min habakar is to exclude the nevad, the animal that's worshipped as avodah zarah. Umin hatzon lahotzi as hamuktzah. Min hatzon is to exclude the animal designated for avodah zarah. Kishu omer min habakar lamata. And then the Bryce is continuing when it says min habakar. When it says min habakar, that's to exclude again treifa, and these are all animals that are excluded from being karbanos. And the Brisa continues, V'halodinu. Now, why do we even need a pasuk? Isn't it logical? Rashi says, V'halodinu de treifa lo sikrav. It's logical that a treifa lo sakariv shouldn't be offered as a carbon. V'lam likra. What do we need a pasuk for? That's the point of the Brisa. V'halodinu, isn't it logical? Uma balmum. If by an animal that has a blemish, shemuteres lahedya, which a blemish, it's still permitted to be eaten by a regular person. That doesn't make it that it's not kosher. Asura legavo, but it is asur legavo. It's asur to be brought on the mizbeach. So treifa, if you have an animal that's a treifa is an animal with a mortal wound. Sha'asur lehedyot, such an animal is asur. It's prohibited to be eaten by a regular person. It's not kosher. Ein din sha'asur legavoa. Isn't it logical that it should be asur legavoa? So what do we need the pasuk for? And the Gemara continues, Chaylev and Dam yochichu. Chaylev and Dam, they can prove the other way. Sha'asur and lahedyon, because Chaylev and Dam, that's the non-kosher fat, and Dam is the blood. So those are parts of the animal that are also for a regular person. You can't eat Chaylev or Dam. Umutar and Lagavoa, but they're mutar Lagavoa. Those are actually burned on the Mizbeach. They're part of the sacrificial portions. And so therefore we do have such an example of something that's asur lahedyot and mutar Lagavoa. And so therefore it's not necessarily logical that we would say by treifa that it would be asur legavoa. And the Gemara says, no, malachaylev v'dam shekein boyin mechlal heter, but you can't bring a proof from chaylev and dam because they come from something which is mutter. The rest of the animal is mutter for a hedyot, for a regular person. Tomar v'treifa shekula asur, but treifa is something that's entirely asur for hedyot. So again, it seems like it should be logical if it's entirely asur lehedyot. It should be logical that it's asur legavoa. Velote mutaris legavoa. So therefore, again, it should not be mutter legavoa. What do we need a pasuk for? It should be logical. And the Gemara continues, malika tochiach. Well, malika can prove the other way. Shekula is Malika, if it's done, let's say outside the Beis HaMikdash, it's completely asur. V'asur lahedyot, the whole bird is asur. It's asur to a regular person. Umutaris legavo, and it's mutter legavo. It's mutter to go on the mizbeach. And so again, we have examples of that. But the Brisa says, Ma'ala Malika shekein kedushasa osarta. By Malika, it's different because kedushasa, that which makes it sanctified, which makes it holy, is what makes it asur. Rashi explains shekein kedushasa osarta b'davar shu kadosh legavoa, with the very action that it becomes sanctified to be brought on the Mizbeach, the Hainu Malika, which is Malika, Ba Neseres Lahedyot, it's through that it's becoming Asur to a regular person. Aval Treifa, but that has nothing to do with Treifa. By a Treifa, Eina Kedusha Mishum Treifas, there's no holiness because of the fact that it's a Treifa. Ve'akati Kra Lamali, so still we're back to the question, what do we need the Pasuk for? As the Brisa continues, Masha'ein can be treifa, what's not true by treifa. Again, Shein Kedushasa Osarta, it's not what makes it Kadosh, that is what is making it Asr. And the Brisa continues, Vim Heshafta, and if you're going to have some kind of refutation, Kishu Omer, Min HaBakar Lamata, when it says Min HaBakar Lamata, Shein Talmud Lomer, the Pasuk doesn't need to say it, Lahotzi Asat Treifa. So that comes to exclude the treifa. In other words, the Brisa is concluding, if there's some reason why it's not logical, we have the Pasuk to teach us that, again, the treifa is not allowed to be brought as a carbon. And Rashi explains, Ma'im heshafta ha'eincha motzi min hadin shehem mutaras, if you cannot find logically that it is mutter. And the Shita Mekubetzes has a slightly expanded girsa here. Vim heshaftim timsa tshuva, if you have some kind of answer, response, lahater treifa min hadin, that you can say that treifa is mutter from logic. So then again, harelach mikra min haTorah she'asur, we have a pasuk from the Torah that it is in fact prohibited to be brought as a carbon. And the Gemara continues and asks on the Brisa, Ma im shafta, what does it mean im shafta? Again, what does it mean if you have some kind of response? That was the Divrei HaMaschil of the Rashi that we just read again, but the Shita Mekubetzes had an expanded version of that Rashi going on the line right before of im shafta. But again, the point is, Ma im shafta, what does the Brisa mean? That there is some way that we might have understood that treifa should be mutter, that we need a pasuk to say asur. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav says, Mishum de'ikol meimar, because one could make the following argument. Minchas ha'omer tochiach. Minchas ha'omer can prove the other way. Sha'asur lahedyot, because it is asur lahedyot. Again, we're talking about the new grain, which is asur. Umutaris legavoa, and yet it is mutter legavoa. We still offer this minchas ha'omer, and so therefore you could have made that argument over here by treifa as well. But the Gemara says you can't make that argument because ma'ala minchas ha'omer. What's unique about minchas ha'omer? Shekein materes chadash. That's able to be mater chadash. It's able to be mater. It permits the new grain. Therefore, you can't necessarily bring a proof to an animal that's a treifa. And the Gemara says, well, what about Bashvias? What about during the Shemitah year? There's nothing to be matir then. It's prohibited because it's the Shemitah year. And the Gemara continues, no, Shvias Nami, even in the Shemitah year, Shekein Materes Sfichin B'Shvias. What about the fact that the Minchas HaOmer is able to permit the Sfichin, which is the aftergrowth on Shvias on the Shemitah year? And the Gemara says that's not necessarily true. Rabbi Akiva, we can be following Rabbi Akiva. The Yamar Sfichin Asurim B'Shvias, he says that Sfichim are Asur on Shvias. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Acha bar Abba le Rav Ashi, Rav Acha bar Abba said to Rav Ashi, le Rabbi Akiva nami lefroch. According to Rabbi Akiva, also we can ask, Ma le minchas ha'omer, what's unique about minchas ha'omer? Shekein materes chadash b'chutz la'aretz. It allows, it is a permitter of the new grain outside of Eretz Yisrael. There you have the restrictions of the Shemitah year. Ve'afilu ma'adamar chadash b'chutz la'aretz lav doraisa. And even according to the one who says the chadash in chutz la'aretz is not asur on a doraisa level, so there's nothing really to be matir in that sense. But shekein ba lahatir lav shebesocha, but still it's being matir something because it's being matir the lav that is within it. And that is referring to the fact that the burning of the komets of the Minchas HaOmer permits the remainder of the Omer itself, and therefore that itself makes it a matir. So again, you wouldn't be able to bring a proof from that to the case of an animal that's a treifa. And the Gemara continues and asks, Samarle Rav Acha mi Difti l'Ravina, Rav Acha from Difti said to Ravina, Yihachi, if so, if you want to make that argument, treifa nami takriv, you could say that a treifa also should be offered. V'tater, lav shebesochen, it should be able to be matir, the lav within it. We should just say that it's matir, the lav within it. And so the Gemara continues and says, Ela parachachi, rather we can ask like this, Ma'ala minchas ha'omer, what is unique about minchas ha'omer? Shekein mitzvasa bekach, this is the entire mitzvah of minchas ha'omer. The whole idea is that you bring the minchas ha'omer from the new grain to permit the new grain, and so therefore again you cannot bring a proof to treifa, and we don't necessarily have a logical reason that an animal that's a treifa should be kosher for the mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Ma'ala minchas ha'omer shekein meruba mitzvasa. Minchas ha'omer is unique because the mitzvah is increased. There's more to the mitzvah, the materes chadash, because it permits chadash, it permits the new grain. Tomer v'treifa, whereas by treifa that's not true. And tzvichin asur, and then the Gemara said tzvichin are osur, according to Rabbi Akiva, kedusha shvius nohegas behu, meaning the kedusha shvius, the sanctity of shvius of the Shemitah year applies to tzvichin again. Tzvichin is that which grows on its own. V'chayavin bebior, since kedusha shvius applies, it has to have biur, it has to be cleared from the house, mishana sha'avra, from the year before, because again, once it runs out, once the food runs out for the wild animals in the field, it has to be gotten rid of. Hilkach ein ha'omer matiran, so therefore, the omer actually is not going to matter them. V'hanis baru kulan, they're all going to be destroyed. Svichem asurin min habiur va'elach, it's talking about being asur from the time of biur and onward. T'yolef mehein lo nizra v'lo nesof, as to Hossein, it's learned from the pasuk. V'chi me'achar shein zor mehecha osvin limit al hasvichim shehein asurim. This pasuk teaches that which grows on its own is asur. Ubiur mishateir v'yashniya, and the time of biur is from when the second rain falls. The havila kala l'chayish besada, that's the time that the food runs out for the wild animals in the field. Kidetanya ad mosai nenim v'sorfim betevin v'kashel shvius mishateir v'yashniya b'Meseches Tainis. That's what it says in Meseches Tainis. You have from that time of the second rain. Hilkach, therefore, Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's tzricha kra lahotzi treifa. The pasuk is necessary in order to be motzi treifa, in order to exclude a treifa. In other words, according to Rabbi Akiva, the kal v'chomer does not necessarily work, because we can prove again from minchas ha'omer. Minchas ha'omer is something which is mutter, even though it is asur lehedyot, even though it's new grain that's asur lehedyot, it is muteres legavoa, and you can't say that it's unique because it's a matir, because according to Rabbi Akiva, let's say in a Shemitah year, who Rabbi Akiva also holds tzvichin are asur, it is not going to be a matir. And the Gemara then said that we can say that Minchas HaOmer is unique because it's Matir Chodosh in Chutz La'aretz. And the Gemara then said, Va'afilu l'man domer b'Meseches Kiddushin b'sof Perakama, even according to the one who says in Meseches Kiddushin, at the end of the first parak, the Chodosh b'Chutz La'aretz lav doraisa, the Chodosh is not also in Chutz La'aretz on a doraisa level, v'lo choshev leheter, and therefore it wouldn't be considered to be a permitter of that. Afilu hachi yesh bo ribusa, but still there is a chiddush, there's something unique about the Minchas HaOmer, to Materes lav shebesocha, because it actually is a permitter of the lav within itself. Lav de lechem v'koli v'charma lo sochlu shebesoch mincha atzma materes afilu Rabbi Akiva. Again, the isser of chadosh within the mincha itself, it's being mater according to Rabbi Akiva. Shem nechlu shirayim lo yavar hochlan misham chadosh. If somebody is going to eat the remainder of this minchas ha'omer, it's not going to be a violation of chadosh. Ela misham shvius. Maybe it'll be a violation of shvius of the Shemitah year, but it will not be a violation of chadosh. Tomer v'treifa, whereas by treifa she'ina materes klum, it's not a matter of anything. And so again, v'lamali cross. So why is it that we need a pasuk? The kal v'chomer therefore is still intact. And Rashi continues, the Gemara then said, maybe we need a pasuk, because Salka Daita Chamina, one might have thought Treifa Nami to Karev Kiminchas HaOmer. The Treifa also can be offered on the Mizbeach like Minchas HaOmer, and that'll also be a matir, lahatir lav shebesoch. It will matir the lav within itself. Sha'ochla lo yavr mishum Treifa lo tochal. One who eats it will not transgress, because Treifa lo tochal. But then the Gemara said, Shekein mitzvasa bekach. But when it comes to the Minchas HaOmer, that is the whole idea of the mitzvah. She efshar lahavi min hayosh, and it's impossible to bring minchas ha'omer from the old grain. She'ein chadash mutter ben yanacher. There is no way that chadash is mutter in any other fashion. Tomer b'treifa she'efshar lahavi ksheira. Whereas by an animal that's a treifa, you don't have to bring a treifa. You can bring an animal that is kosher. And the Gemara continues and offers another explanation why the kal v'chomer is not sufficient to demonstrate that a treifa cannot be brought on the Mizbeach. Reish Lakish says, Mishum Dikal Amemar, because one can say, Mefatim HaKetoris Yochiach, the one who prepares the Ketoris, the incense, that should prove the Kal V'chomer wrong. Because Sha'asr Lehedyot Mutter Legavoa, that's something where there's an example of something which is Asr Lehedyot, it's prohibited for a regular person, and Mutter Legavoa, it's Mutter for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara questions the terminology over here, Mefatim, the person who's preparing it, Gavru is always a person, what do we mean? It's Mutter Legavoa. And so the Gemara clarifies, Ella rather, what we mean to say is as follows. Pitom HaKetoris Yochiach, in general, the preparation of the incense should prove the Kal V'chomer wrong. Sha'asr Lehedyot, because the Ketoris is asr for a regular person, Mutter Legavoa, and it's Mutter for the Almighty, it's Mutter for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for the Mizbeach. But the Gemara again says, Ma'ala Pitom HaKetoris, you can't bring a proof from Pitom HaKetoris, that's unique. Shekein mitzvah subakach, because again, that is the entire mitzvah, that's the nature of the mitzvah. And the Gemara continues and offers another explanation why the Kal V'chomer is not sufficient. Mar Berei de Ravina Amar Mar, the son of Ravina said, Misham Diikal Amemar, because one can say, Shabbos tochiach, that Shabbos will prove the other way, Sha'asura lehedyot, because it's also for a regular person, Umuteres legavo, it's mutter legavo. What that means is that korbanos can be brought on Shabbos, even though those same kinds of activities cannot be done on Shabbos by a regular person. But the Gemara again says, Ma'ala Shabbos, what's unique about Shabbos, Shekein hutra michlala, etzel hedyot b'mila, you do have some things that are permitted by a regular person. For example, Mila on Shabbos can be permitted. But the Gemara says, Atu Mila tzorech hedyot, who would you call Mila something that's for a regular person? Mila mitzvahi, Mila is in the category of a mitzvah. But again, the Gemara says, Ella rather Ma'ala Shabbos, what's unique about Shabbos, Shekein mitzvah b'kach, again, that is the entire nature of the mitzvah. And Rashi explains, Shabbos muteres legavoa, when we say Shabbos is mutter for the Almighty, we just mean lahakriv tamidin umusafin, that the carbon tamid, carbon musaf can be brought. And again, the Gemara said, Shekein mitzvasa b'kach, but that is the whole nature of the mitzvah. She efshar lahakriv tamidin umusafin elabo bayom. The tamid and the musaf can only be brought that day. But again, avol treifa efshar b'ksheira, but in terms of a treifa, an animal that's a treifa, one can always bring a ksheira, an animal that is kosher, that is always a possibility. And the Gemara continues with another explanation why the Kal V'chomer might not be sufficient. Rav Ada bar Abba Amar Misham Diikal Amemar Kilayim Tochiach. Rav Ada bar Abba says, because one can say the Kilayim can prove the Kal V'chomer wrong. Sha'asur and Lehedyot, because that's an example of something which is also for a regular person. A person cannot have shatnez, cannot wear shatnez, cannot wear Kilayim. Umutar and Legavoa, but it is mutter Legavoa, and that's referring to the fact that a Kohen, that the avnate of the big day kahuna is shatnez. And the Gemara says, well, Ma'ala Kilayim, but what's unique about Kilayim, Shekein Hutru Michlalan Eitzel Hedyot B'tzitzis, you do have a time when shatnez is permitted, for example, by tzitzis. But the Gemara again says, Atu tzitzis tzorech hedyot, do you refer to tzitzis as something that is just for a regular person? Mitzvah, again, that's in the category of a mitzvah. And so the Gemara says, Ella rather, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amud Aleph.